Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Enting, and today I'm going to be talking about the motion this House believes that rehabilitation should be the only consideration in criminal sentencing. I'm first going to start with some observations about criminal justice motions, then going to move on to some common mistakes to take note of with this motion specifically, and last of all run through some strategies that you might want to consider on both proposition and opposition. So first of all, on things that you should think about in criminal justice system motions. Generally, when we think about motions that have to do with crime and punishment, we want to think about the aims of criminal justice systems more broadly. And the standard three that you will hear a lot are deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. A common mistake here is taking these to be absolute goods. You should also, in every criminal justice debate, also consider why these are valuable aims or not, as the case may be. The second thing you normally think about in criminal justice motions are the types of stakeholders, because very often these stakeholders that you have in criminal justice debates tend to be the same. You have perpetrators of crime and you have victims of crime. Of course, when you're talking about these groups, you need to be careful as well to not homogenize these groups, because these groups are very often dissimilar. And so you must very carefully consider the characteristics of these groups, keeping in mind their separate the types of crimes, the separate reasons why they may have committed those crimes, and then consider what their incentives or their decision-making calculus might be and how your policy might or might not affect them. Okay, so that's general thoughts about criminal justice debates. Going to move on now to common mistakes you should take note of with this particular debate. First of all, I think one of the very important words in this motion is the word only. That should signal to you that this is not a debate about whether or not rehabilitation is important, but rather the degree to which we should prioritize rehabilitation ahead of other considerations. And so a very common mistake is to stop on government at the idea that rehabilitation is important without giving reasons why it should be the only consideration in criminal sentencing. And this makes it very easy to be overcome by any opposition team that can point out that they also agree that rehabilitation is important, but perhaps it should not be the only thing that we are considering when sentencing people. The second thing is that characterization is something that is very important in this debate. While this is a value judgment debate, it is actually also a discussion of what rehabilitation is and consists of and what the alternative looks like. So teams, upon seeing this motion, should consider what they are actually trying to defend and treat it almost like a policy motion where you set out in very clear terms what the world you are defending looks like and what the opposition's world looks like. The reason why you have to do this is because many of your arguments about efficacy are going to be not particularly efficacious unless you can link them to some kind of tangible thing that you are doing when you are making rehabilitation the only consideration in sentencing. And therefore, when you think about this, you need to actually consider what rehabilitation looks like and how it ends up functioning within a criminal justice system. The third thing to take note of is that you must make sure your characterization stays consistent. So for instance, if you're an op, you're probably going to want to say something along the lines of, we don't defend the worst forms of prison systems. We are in favor of things like prison reform. And this is a very strategic thing to do if you're trying to sidestep some of the criticisms that Gov is going to give about the prison systems that you are currently relying on. This means that you, on opposition, if you choose this strategy, you cannot then turn around and say, well, we get maximum deterrence on our side due to harsh conditions in prison, because presumably there is now a tension between the harsh conditions you are saying create deterrence for you and the conditions you're trying to get rid of when you say you are probably in favor of prison reform as well. So this is not to say that you can only stick to one strategy or another, but that when you select strategies and you select characterizations, you need to keep in mind that your characterization must stay consistent across both your substantive arguments and your rebuttals. The last thing to take note of is that you must consider what is symmetric in this debate and what is not. So systemic bias exists on both sides. Keep in mind that saying the system cannot implement punishment well because there is bias isn't automatically a winning argument. You need to explain why there is likely to be less room for bias on your side, even if the other side is biased. Similarly, you probably can't say rehabilitation can't be implemented well because there is going to be existing bias within the system. You need to then explain why you think the existing bias gets worse, and it isn't just there is going to be bias on either sides anyway. So So here you want to consider not just where bias is more likely, but where bias is more likely to be harmful. So you're trying to step out of this trap of things being symmetric in this debate. Okay, so moving now to strategies that you might want to consider within this debate, starting from government. On government, there are broadly two strategies that you can run upon seeing a motion like this. And they're not entirely mutually exclusive, meaning you could potentially choose to run both at the same time, but make it very clear that these are two separate lines of argumentation. The first thing is that you can say, other considerations are illegitimate or have failed in some manner. So this is where you are trying to be more hardline and say, we disagree entirely that deterrence and punishment should be in any ways part of our sentencing. The second strategy is to say, these considerations might be legitimate, but having these considerations actually crowds out any possibility of rehabilitation. Therefore, a system with all three together is simply untenable, and that's why if we had to pick one to focus on, we would want to focus on rehabilitation. So it's up to you which one you choose. Just keep in mind that you should make it very clear which direction you are taking right from the start of your speech. So once you have done this and selected your strategy, you will want to move on to some characterization of rehabilitation. Keep in mind what I said earlier, which is that characterization is going to be really important in this debate if you want to push any kinds of practical benefits on your side, apart from just the principle of whether or not rehabilitation is something that is better to focus on. So you will also want to characterize rehabilitation in some detail on Gov to prevent op from straw manning and saying that this is just going to be a slap on the wrist before murderers are released back out into society, which is a very intuitive response that you would probably expect to come out from the leader of opposition. You will also, while doing characterization, want to preempt some of the more obvious op attacks on feasibility. So attacks such as, how do you know these people aren't just lying to you in order to get released? So if you do your characterization properly, you will realize that your characterization can actually serve as preemptive argumentation that then raises the burdens for opposition if they wish to take this particular argument down. So when you're thinking of characterization of rehabilitative systems, you can look towards Nordic systems, which tend to have prisons with more common areas and community spaces, tend to have community programs that allow prisoners to go out into the community in order to conduct various forms of community service. They give prisoners the ability to engage in studies or hobbies, and have prison workers who serve as contact officers that monitor mental health and social progress rather than just being there to enforce the rules. So all of these are things that you can think of in a rehabilitative system. And in fact, these are things that are not an exhaustive list of what a rehabilitative system might look like. So that's also something you might want to consider. In addition, you would want to characterize existing prison systems. So for instance, you might want to point out that existing prison systems tend to be filled with violence, drug use, inmate abuse, overcrowding, poor physical environments, poor food, poor sanitation and hygiene conditions, all of these things which tend to be more likely than not just because you are asserting this, but rather due to an increasing push towards privatization of those prisons, which means there is a huge incentive to sort of cut costs and try and increase profits in that way. So what you're doing here is not only are you characterizing rehabilitation and why that's something you should consider, but also consider the ways in which the other side might be bad. So your characterization serves as a preemptive attack on any arguments that the other side might run. So now that you're done with characterization, you probably want to then think of the aims of the criminal justice system. So like I mentioned earlier, something that you are thinking of every time pretty much you get a motion about criminal justice debates. So the aim of the criminal justice system, intuitively, on proposition at least, is to keep people safe. And I think this is something that is a claim that you can make quite easily when you are thinking about what are we actually trying to do. And here you can think of things like deterrence even as something that aims towards keeping people safe. And the way it does this is sort of inspire fear in people. And so what you're doing is you're looking at the three tenets of the criminal justice system and trying to find the underlying presumptions that they are all working towards. What's then the problem? Well, you could argue that your existing system just doesn't work to achieve the goal of safety. You might point out a number of reasons for this, right? The first is that it's psychologically debilitating to be in prison because you are deprived of liberty, you lose your social support networks in your family, you lose personal control and quite a bit of self-worth. The second thing you might point out is that prison often encourages behavior that is not conducive to reintegrating back into society. You might consider things like the existence of prison gangs, or the need to be tough in some manner or posture in some manner that's not good for successful reintegration. Last of all, you would consider that being in prison probably means you lose skills, there is a CV gap, and there is a lot of stigma then surrounding you once you come out of prison. The impact of this, of course, is that most inmates that are released every year end up returning to prison because recidivism rates are very high. And so what you might point out is, if most of them are returning to prison, that means that clearly the system is not able to keep these people from committing crimes, which similarly means that the system is failing in keeping society safe. Therefore, because a system that includes considerations of deterrence and retribution doesn't work in fulfilling some of the fundamental goals of the criminal justice system, which is safety, we should therefore move towards something else that is better able to sort of fulfill these goals. So then you are off to why rehabilitation works, or is a better way of judging all this. Rehabilitation works because it releases individuals who are mentally ready to reintegrate into society and are equipped with skills, and it prevents individuals from reoffending by preventing quite a large number of the problems that you raised earlier. So for instance, if the problem is discrimination when you come out of prison, and the fact that you have lost skills and you are unable to find jobs, presumably rehabilitation is able to give you some kind of job training, which means that it increases your opportunities in the future. If the problem is that you are more likely to commit crimes once you get out because you have lost so many social support networks that you are unable to function properly in society afterwards, then rehabilitation also solves for this by giving you community spaces or opportunities to integrate with the community and work with them through community service programs, or gives you the ability to still contact your friends and family due to the sort of open prison systems. So all of this means that you can argue based on your own characterization of what a rehabilitative system looks like, that you are much more able to reintegrate people into society with a rehabilitative system than with one that is focused on punishment and on deterrence. The third argument that you can run is probably just an argument about what is fairer or more just. So here you might consider that the state has the obligation of helping individuals who are criminals. And here you want to sort of like seize the narrative that the most vulnerable people in this debate doesn't just include the victims of crime, but that that criminals themselves are victims of a system that has failed them. And here what you might point out is that criminal offenders are often individuals who have the greatest social disadvantages, which have sort of forced them into a life of economic necessity, force them into a life of crime out of things like economic necessity, or things like the system not being able to spot signs of problematic behavior earlier and educating them differently, or allowing them ways in which to redirect their impulses into more productive social goods. So all of this you can build to an argument that says, because the state has already failed them in so many ways, it therefore has a principal obligation to sort of help them reintegrate, not just lock them away continuously for something that is actually a state fault. The last thing here that you could discuss, and this is probably more where back half can come in, is to actually consider in greater detail why systems of rehabilitation might be incompatible with systems of with punitive systems that seek to both carry out retributive justice as well as promote deterrence. And what you might consider is to actually do a deep dive into how people respond to punitive measures. And here you might argue that especially because the state was at fault in the first place, a harsh prison system that is focused on punishment and deterrence leads to a resentment of a system that first of all pushed you into those conditions, and then second of all gave you no way to escape those conditions. So So there is a sense of unfairness and blame here that makes them more likely to resent the system and therefore act against it once they leave prison. Compare it then to a rehabilitative system where you then have more space for reflection and remorse in a way that doesn't push you to be resentful of society or resentful of the criminal justice system that you see as not looking out for your needs or your concerns. Second of all, I think you could also argue that rehabilitation is the only narrative that recognizes the reality of social inequality. And here, what you can argue is that promoting a narrative that offenders need to be rehabilitated signifies a sort of social acceptance or promotes a social acceptance that your actions are not only your choice, but they are dictated by the circumstances around you. And what you can argue is that if you set policies based on this narrative, you end up with systems that are more preemptive in order to deal with these social circumstances. So you are more likely to cut crime off before it occurs, and as well as more likely to rehabilitate people after, because you are more likely to forgive and allow people to reintegrate. While on the converse, policies that ignore these kinds of social inequalities simply end up being enforced in ways that are unduly punitive on the already disadvantaged, while deepening resentment amongst inmates that make it much harder for them to reintegrate into society in the future. And this is how you can sort of deepen some of the arguments about recidivism that are coming out from top half, while also sort of shifting the focus of the debate onto sort of the narrative that this pushes onto society and why you think people are, why you think better policies are likely to get passed on your side. Okay, so moving on now to opposition. A couple of things to say for the opposition. The first is that opposition also has two strategies, but in this case, I think one strategy is much more advisable than the other. So the first strategy is arguing that you are completely against rehabilitation, meaning you don't even think it should be a consideration. I think this is actually pretty hard to do, so I would advise you go for the second strategy, which is saying, well, we like rehabilitation and we think it's important, but we also think that we need to combine this with consideration of other factors such as deterrence and retribution. And if you do this, what you've essentially done is to take the wind out of the sail for quite a lot of government teams that would have focused very heavily on why rehabilitation is good without necessarily explaining why rehabilitation is the only factor that we should end up focusing on. On opposition, you should also discuss the aims of criminal justice systems. And what you should say here is, rather than only making society safe, criminal justice systems also aim to provide people with a sense of security that comes from knowing that justice has been achieved. And what you have to do here is sort of like lay out why you think retribution and deterrence are important for making people feel as though justice has been carried out. And it's useful here to just give some intuition pumps. So many of us share the intuition that people who commit serious crimes should be punished, even if punishment doesn't serve some kind of broader social aim. Consider the following scenario. Suppose somebody just murders their spouse in a fit of rage, and you as a judge have absolute certainty that they feel remorse and would never commit another crime. And as a result, society would be absolutely safe. Then take us a step further and realize that you are also in a position where you could sort of promote deterrence by pretending that this person has been sent to jail and faking the evidence for this. So technically, if you do this, all the aims of the criminal justice system would still have been fulfilled. You would still get deterrence because you have faked evidence that this person has gone to jail for like a very long amount of time. You would still get safety because you have absolute certainty that this person would never commit another crime. But I think most of us would still feel an intuition that this is unjust in some way. And it's not particularly rational, but I think people do have these beliefs about justice and about why retribution does need to play a part in ensuring that this is that punishment is carried out. Okay, so you can do all of these arguments about why you think retribution is important, which is just that, first of all, this is only just, in addition to being intuitive, it is only just that when somebody has an intentional or knowing violation of the important rights of somebody else, that they be punished. as long as they were responsible for it, right? Meaning as long as they, they weren't clinically insane at that time, or they had no other extenuating circumstances. If that was the case, then those extenuating circumstances would already be taken into account. But all else being equal, they should be punished for violating the rights of another person. And what you can argue here is that all of us have the opportunity to live in a relatively secure state. And and the reason we live in a relatively secure state is because we restrict our own rights, we restrict our own ability to harm other people, and everybody doing that creates the sense of security that we live in. And so what happens here, when you do a wrong in this sense, is a failure to accept the burden that makes the benefit of collective security possible. And so what punishment does is it removes the benefit that the wrongdoer cannot fairly lay claim to, the benefit being your right to autonomy and your right to safety and security. So in exchange for taking that right away from someone else, as well as for shirking your own burden, this punishment now falls upon you. So you could absolutely argue that is the way the justice system works and should work, and that this is fair because in most cases, people are not forced to commit these crimes, but rather choose actively to commit these crimes. Now, in response to all of the Gov claims about how all crimes are a result of state failure, you could very just simply point out that poverty exists, but not every person that lives in poverty ends up committing crimes, because in many cases, there are also active choices that you have to make. Similarly, extenuating circumstances exist for a lot of people, but not everybody in those same extenuating circumstances chooses to take the extra step to commit the crime. So while yes, in some sense, crime is born out of state failure, it cannot be said that the blame entirely lies with the state and not with the individual. And that's what you should push back on when Prop tries to run a principled claim that the state has an obligation to help you. The second argument that you might want to make here is just a simple argument of deterrence to point out that rehabilitation for a lot of people doesn't carry the same kind of connotation of fear or harsh treatment that punishment or jail sentences would. And you could also argue that because people make very rational decisions when judging whether or not to commit crime, and they do weigh the consequences of those crimes in their decision making, rehabilitation as a consequence, as opposed to, punishment, might mean that you have people for whom the threshold to committing a crime is lowered, and this could potentially mean you end up having more crime in society. Whereas a harsh on crime stance probably means you end up having more deterrence. The third thing you might want to argue is a claim about victims and vigilante justice. And I think this ties very nicely to why individuals often have strong intuitions about punishment and the role that punishment holds in the justice system. And so the argument here is, because victims or because people can no longer trust the justice system to carry out justice in a way that they, trust, you could end up with extrajudicial action as opposed to giving up the right of punishment to the state, which is infinitely more preferable. And the last argument you could make is an argument about why subjectivity in sentencing is bad. So what you might want to argue here is that rehabilitation is something that, is quite individualized, because one person may take much longer to be rehabilitated while other people get rehabilitated much faster for various reasons. And so what happens here is that you end up with an individual tailoring of sentences and punishment, which is bad for a number of reasons, or you would argue that it's bad for a number of reasons. The first is just a simple claim that it might invite gaming the system, right? That people could very easily fake rehabilitation in a way that allows them to escape punishment much faster than their fellows who committed the same crime did. The second is just a claim that this is bad because the justice system needs some kind of standardization to ensure that that similar kinds of crimes carry similar kinds of punishments, because this is the only fair way to accord punishment without introducing undue bias. The third argument is that this leads to abuses of power, because analyzing whether or not somebody has been rehabilitated is something that is so subjective. it means that you have more opportunities to introduce things like racial biases or gender biases in sentencing. It means that you probably have people who have committed very severe crimes but are from the majority race, let out from prison much earlier, whereas minority prisoners are kept in prison for significantly longer because therapists are, or assessors are less likely to relate to them, or are less likely to see them as rehabilitated, or are more likely to perceive them as being likely to commit crimes in the future. So this is where we finally get to the symmetry thing that I was talking about earlier. So while it's true that biases exist on both sides, this is a way for you to argue that biases in sentencing actually get much worse because you introduce an element of subjective assessment, whereas more objective or more standardized assessments are less biased. Of course, this is arguable, but this is like one line of argument you can take, and I suspect this would be a bigger clash on back half than on front half. Okay, so I think those are most of the main claims that you can run in this debate. I would suggest that if you want to follow up on this, you do some reading about what rehabilitative systems actually look like and how successful they have been, as well as some reading about why standardization in law might be important, and why and independent reasons why on principle we might want to prioritize things like retribution or deterrence or rehabilitation. Last of all, I think it might be interesting to consider some of what the US is trying to do in terms of rehabilitation and appeals, and how those have introduced similar kinds of biases into the rehabilitation process. All right, that's it from me. Thank you.